I think we'll get started and let folks trickle in as they get here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dori Drachman from Peterborough Energy Action, or PEA, and we are the main sponsor of tonight's panel discussion. We're very excited that all of you are joining us and that you're joining us for the kickoff of our campaign, which I'll explain to you in just a few minutes, but wanting to make sure that you are here for the right event. This is a panel discussion on how is New Hampshire's climate changing and what can we do about it, with Dr. Cameron Wake of UNH and Dr. Erich Osterberg of Dartmouth. We're excited to share what they have with all of you as well. So before I get to the campaign and the panel, I just want to do a couple of Zoom housekeeping announcements. Probably most of you have heard this so many times now, but it's worth repeating. To please keep your microphone on mute unless you are speaking, and that if you have a question, to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you haven't used chat, you hover over it, you'll see an icon for chat. Click on that and then move to the right and you'll see the chat box, and you can type in there, and when you hit return, it'll be visible to everybody else. You can also modify your view of the screen, and you might want to put it on speaker view so that you can see the speaker easily. The way you do that is to go up to the top right corner, where right now you don't have the option of speaker view because the slides are up. But when slides are not up, you can click on speaker view or gallery view, where you'll see everybody's picture. Speaker view, you get to see the speaker in a larger picture. Now we can get on to more substance. And actually, right before that, I want to also thank the Monadnock Sustainability Hub, who is the co-sponsor both of our campaign and for tonight's event. We are incredibly grateful for all your support. And so I also wanted to now talk a bit about PEA, Peterborough Energy Action, and our campaign. We are putting a warrant article on the ballot this year for Peterborough's town meeting to ask the town to commit to the goal of transitioning all of the towns, including all residents and businesses, all of the town's electricity to renewable energy by 2030, and all of our heat and transportation by 2050. And then as an initial step toward getting there, we are also committing to create a plan to reach these goals by the end of 2022. When this resolution is approved, which, because we have great faith that we will do this as a town, we will be joining 5 other New Hampshire communities that already have these goals, including Hanover, Concord, Plainfield, Cornish, and of course our Monadnock neighbors in Keene. And then more broadly, we'll be joining, and this figure just blows me away, we'll be joining over 25% of Americans who live in communities that have made this commitment. So we will be joining a lot of folks who are really committed to making this transition. At the end of the event tonight, I will let you know some ways that you can support our campaign if you're interested, and that's whether or not you live in Peterborough. So now we get to the main event, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists tonight. They are 2 prominent climate scientists working in New Hampshire. One is Dr. Cameron Wake. He is a research professor at the Institute for the Study of Earth, Oceans, and Space at UNH. And he is the Josephine A. Lamprey Professor in Climate and Sustainability at the UNH Sustainability Institute. And then Dr. Osterberg is an associate professor at Dartmouth in the Department of Earth Sciences, in the Department of Earth Sciences. From my perspective, just as impressive as their scholarship is their commitment to working in their communities to reverse global warming and adapt to a changing climate. So in other words, they walk their walk. So Dr. Cameron Wake is working with his community in Kittery to pass a 100% resolution similar to the one that we are working to pass. He is also the chair of the Kittery Climate Adaptation Committee that's charged with making the town more resilient in the face of warming temperatures and rising sea levels. And Dr. Osterberg is the vice chair of the Upper Valley Adaptation Working Group, and they have a mission to help the Upper Valley communities to become more resilient to climate change by leading forums and training residents to become community leaders for meaningful climate change action. And without any further ado, I am going to then pass this on to Cameron.
Go, Erich.
I'm gonna start off here. Dori, thank you for that kind introduction. So I'm gonna share my screen, and then.
Sorry, Erich.
No problem. So can you all see that? Okay, great. So what we're gonna do here is I'm going to start off by giving a sort of broader overview of climate change from the national and even the global perspective. And then Cameron is gonna zoom in on New Hampshire and look at some of the impacts of climate change right here in our neighborhood. And then we're gonna wrap up by talking about some of the things that we're doing in our communities that Dori was just talking about. So I'm gonna start off with a slide that perhaps some of you have seen before. And this is just the global average temperature of the surface of the Earth, right? The whole entire planet, take the average temperature at the surface, and on the left, we're starting about 140 years ago in 1880, and on the right we have today. And so what we can see is that over the last 140 years, the global warming is easily apparent. We've warmed by over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And what's really remarkable, not just to the general public, but I'd say to climate scientists as well, is just how hot these last 5 years have been. We saw this continuing trend all the way up until 2014. And then this dot here is 2015. And that was just earth shattering in terms of how much it broke the previous record. And then we had 2016, which shattered even that record. And I don't know if you heard the news, but we just learned in the last week or so that 2020 is now tied for 2016 as the #1 year. So that point is not on this curve yet, but it'll be right here. And thinking about a little more locally, basically New Hampshire and Vermont look very similar to this. We've had a pretty similar overall warming, and actually the shape of the curve looks pretty similar, with kind of slow warming in the early part of the 20th century, a bit of a plateau in the middle part, and then a more abrupt warming in the last few decades. And Cameron is going to talk about that in a little more detail in a few minutes. So what's really important to understand about this curve is that we now know, we being the scientific community, we now know that since 1960, all of the warming that we've seen is from human activities. And most of that is from greenhouse gases, mostly CO2 and methane. Changes to the land surface that humans have done have contributed to this as well. Deforestation has contributed. But if we take all human activities together, all of this warming that we've seen since 1960 is from those activities. And the reason that we can say that with such certainty is that there aren't all that many things that change the temperature of the entire planet like this. So we know that greenhouse gases like CO2 is something that can change the temperature of the whole planet. And then the other things that can do it, the things that can change climate naturally, we see in natural cycles, thousands of years ago, are things like volcanic eruptions and things like the strength of the sun. And we often think about the sun as this sort of persistent ball of energy in the sky, right? It doesn't really change. But it turns out that it does change. Sometimes it's a little stronger and sometimes it's a little weaker. And so what I'm showing here is that same temperature curve in the top that I just showed you. And at the bottom here in black is actually the record of how the sun's intensity has changed over that same time period. And you can see this big persistent 11-year cycle, which is actually the 11-year solar sunspot cycle you might be familiar with. But if we just smooth those out, what you can see is that the sun got a little bit more intense from the beginning part of this record up till around 1950, 1955. But since then, the sun has actually been getting weaker and weaker, despite the fact that our temperatures are going in the opposite direction, reaching records almost every year. And so volcanic eruptions have also not been changing over this time period. So we know that CO2 is the cause. And we know that this CO2 increase that we've seen is from human activities. And we can talk about that in more detail if you want, but I suspect a lot of you are already pretty convinced of that. To put this CO2 change that we've seen into a little bit more geological context, I'm in an earth science department here, so we think about climate change not just over human timescales, but over thousands or even millions of year timescales. And so when we look at the CO2 that we have today, 415 parts per million, we know that it has been millions of years since the Earth was naturally above 400 parts per million. And we know that in order to get there, it took millions of years. So that this modern rise in CO2 that we've seen and the modern rise in temperatures that we've seen, these are much, much faster than anything we see in the natural climate cycles that we know have occurred in the past. So for CO2, it's 150 times faster than what we see even during the fastest changes in CO2 that are just caused by natural causes. And just to give you some perspective, the last time CO2 really jumped was when we came out of the last ice age, about 20 to 14,000 years ago. And in that time period, it jumped about 80 parts per million. And that took 6,000 years. And in the last 43 years, my lifetime, we've gone up that same amount, 80 parts per million. So we've done that in 43 years, and an extremely rapid natural rise took 6,000 years to do the same thing. So this experiment that we're running now with the atmosphere and with the climate system, we can't find examples of when this has happened naturally in the Earth. This is new uncharted territory. And we can see the results of this experiment all around us, more and more every year that goes by. Just this past year, of course, we started the year with these historic wildfires down in Australia. And then later on in the summer, we had the fires hitting California, again, setting records. And then in Colorado, again, setting records. And we know that climate change is part of this story, that when it's warmer and when the winds are blowing stronger, that the leaf litter and the tree litter, the fuel for these fires dries out faster. And when the fires start, they become these monster devastating fires. We saw record high temperatures, not just global average. We saw over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia, well above the Arctic Circle. And by the way, the fires up in Siberia were also historic this year because of these high temperatures. We saw a record hurricane season. We had the most named hurricanes, or the most named storms, tropical storms and hurricanes that we'd ever seen. We ran out of letters, right? We had to go to the Greek alphabet. We only had to do that one other time, and that was in 2005. But we had even more storms this year than we did in 2005. And one of the really important things that's happened in climate science just in the past 5-6 years, I'd say, is that we have gotten really good at being able to say with much more certainty when things like hurricanes are actually caused by climate change. And so we can now say with certainty that these hurricanes that we're seeing, they are in fact made more powerful, and they are wetter. They drop more rain and cause more flooding than they would without human-caused climate change. We also know that heat kills by itself. You don't need to do it through a hurricane, but heat by itself is actually the #1 cause of death from a natural disaster in the United States. You might think it's hurricanes or tornadoes, but it's actually heat. And we can see examples of this all around the world. We can see it just in Chicago. We go to 2003, this heat wave that swept through Western Europe, particularly in France, 35,000 people died. And I know we're starting to get numb to numbers like this because of the pandemic, but just think about that, 35,000 people because of heat stroke. And we have research now that can say things like 70% of those deaths were caused by climate change. And so as we look to the future, we know that the future is really a choice. It's a choice about which path we take in terms of our energy and our carbon emissions. Do we continue on a path where we continue to burn emissions at the rate that we have been? Or do we dramatically reduce our CO2 emissions? And if we are able to reduce them, then we can look at a future that's more like 4 degrees warmer by the end of the century. That's this lower scenario. But if we continue on, we're looking at about double that, more like 8 degrees by the end of this century. And to give that a little more context, the times when you might notice this the most is, say, in the middle of the summer. And so in Hanover, typically right now in our today's climate, actually really 1990s climate, we would have about 1 week a summer that were over 90 degrees, 7 days total. But you can see how that changes under these two scenarios. 3.5 weeks under the lower scenario, and basically, all of July and August in this upper scenario above 90 degrees. And we know that that's when people start feeling the effects of heat stress. And so you might think to yourself, 8 degrees doesn't sound like all that much, right? Maybe today was 8 degrees colder than yesterday, so who cares about 8 degrees? But to put this into context, the last time that the Earth was 8 degrees colder than today, this is what the New Hampshire coastline looked like, okay? We were in an ice age. The last ice age, the peak of the last ice age was only 8 or 9 degrees, global average, colder than today, right? So 8 degrees is huge. It is massive. And of course, these days, we know that the glaciers are going in the opposite direction, right? They're melting quickly. This is a glacier I take Dartmouth students to every year, and we can see how this glacier has melted back in the last century. This is, perhaps you've been there, this is up in Jasper National Park, the Athabasca Glacier. And we did some research showing that pretty much everything you can see in this picture will be gone by 2060 at this rate. And as we melt these glaciers, we know that sea level is going up. Our best estimate for New Hampshire by the end of the century is about 3 feet of sea level rise. But you can see that there's a lot of uncertainty here. We have a lot of uncertainty on the high side about exactly how much sea level will go up based on some uncertainty about how Greenland and Antarctica will melt. And here's where some of that uncertainty comes from. We know that the last time that the Earth was just 2 to 4 degrees warmer, sea level was 16 to 26 feet higher. Now, we know that that is not going to happen in any of our lifetimes. It's just physically impossible. But what's a little disturbing is that it's possible that we could exceed some tipping points in the near future where it might be difficult to stop this future. And so I think about that all the time, and the research is starting to show us some real warning signs. Some people suggest we may have already passed some of these tipping points. I want to emphasize that science is not at all settled. We don't know that, but we are concerned that those tipping points are out there. And so it's not just our own impacts. We have to be thinking about the impacts that we might be imposing on generations in the future. And so, as I said, it's all about a choice. It's a choice about how much CO2 we put into the atmosphere. What do we do about our CO2 emissions when it comes to powering our transportation, powering our electric grid, powering our companies, our homes, and our businesses? So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Cam.
Thanks, Erich. And you're driving the slides, so why not go right to the next one? So if I can summarize what Erich has just said in really four or five climate facts, these are them, right? It's real, it's us, scientists agree, it's bad. He just covered that really quickly in 12 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the New Hampshire and the New England context. And then at the end, we're both going to circle back and talk about how we think we can fix it. But it's pretty clear that we have to figure out how we move to a low carbon and then zero carbon energy system, while at the same time adapting to the inevitable changes. So next slide, Erich.
Sorry, I'm here, I'm trying. There we are.
There we are. So I've written a series of reports with colleagues from across the nation, actually. And so I don't have time to go into all the details, but I did just want to provide you with some resources. So we wrote a New Hampshire climate assessment for northern and southern New Hampshire. And there's a ton more information in these, but just let me share a couple of the key results from this report. So we looked at temperature trends in every season and annually, so very similar to what Erich showed for the entire globe. We've looked at New Hampshire. And what we see really is we see this long-term warming. This is, we're looking at minimum temperatures. So our night times have actually warmed up more than our maximum temperatures. And this is, right, so we're looking at about a 120-year record here, 1895 to 2012. And you can see this is from 5 long-term sites across New Hampshire. So we see lots of year-to-year variability, but we see this really distinct warming since 1970. And really, it's our winters that have warmed the most over that time period. So when you look at this, this is a graph from Climate Central. They update these for every year. So this is data from 1970 to 2020. So this is warming in the 3 winter months, December, January, February. You can see that northeastern part of the US has really been warming the most, right? And so we've seen a 4 to 5 degree Fahrenheit warming on average across the region. And if you've lived here, you know that our winters are a lot warmer. And in part, that's happened because of this ice albedo feedback loop, which you can ask me about in the question period if you want to. Next slide. If you zoom in on Concord, we see that Concord has warmed almost 6 degrees since 1970, right? So that's more than 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade. And that's having really important ramifications for our winters and our winter recreation. Next slide. So this is a report that my colleague at UNH did, Elizabeth Burakowski, and working with Protect Our Winters. And what she did was looked at the income, and this is actually a national average of alpine ski areas. And she looked at the top 5 winters over a 30-year period. And when we have really good winters, so that are cold with lots of snow, across the nation, we see an increase of about $700 million spent at those ski resorts and 11,800 jobs. Conversely, if you look at the bottom 5, and this is actually my picture taken from Sunday River about a decade ago, we lose $1 billion in the economy and we lose 17,400 jobs. And I want to emphasize that those jobs aren't in the big cities, right? These are the jobs in rural areas that really depend upon winter recreation in order to create their livelihood. So it's a wonderful report. And again, these resources are, I've got notes in my slides and you can chase down these resources and look into this more if you'd like to. Next slide. You can also look at other effects in winter. It's not just alpine skiing, but we're seeing the ice on our lakes leave earlier. So spring is arriving earlier. And that's really, I mean, that's a wonderful example of a tipping point, is when you have ice and it's thick, you can go out on the ice and you can go ice fishing, or you can go cross-country skiing, or you can take your snowmobile out there. But when there's no ice, you can't, right? It's a binary system, it's 0 or 1. And so we're seeing across the state the reduction or canceling of a lot of ice fishing derbies because the ice is just no longer safe. And I saw people out sort of last week, and I was just wondering, what are you doing? That ice looks so sketchy right now. I think with this cold weather we're having over the last few days, that's helped out a lot. But you can see in the longest 2 records that we have, Lake Winnipesaukee and Lake Sunapee, really again since 1970, we're seeing ice out dates a week or 2 earlier, which is a significant change. Next slide. This is really sort of, I think this is one of the biggest changes that we've seen. And this is primarily from coastal New Hampshire, but this is true for the entire state as well. What we're seeing is a significant increase in extreme precipitation events in New Hampshire. And we're characterizing those by precipitation events that drop 4 inches or more over a 2-day period. The rain rarely happens over a whole 2 days, but we arbitrarily cut meteorological records at midnight or in the morning. So we're just looking at sort of the storms, right? These big storms that come through. And when you look at these 5 stations in southeastern New Hampshire and 1 in Maine, you see that the number of those events has actually increased significantly, especially through the late 90s and the early 2000s. And that's really what has led to a significant amount of flooding, which southwestern New Hampshire has suffered through as well. It's not only rain, but we're also, creating more impervious surfaces, more houses, more roads, more runoff. That's leading to more flooding. Next slide. And we can examine actually skip that one, Erich. We can examine the social cost of that. And one of the ways we can do that is look at federal expenditures on presidentially declared disasters. So this is the FEMA data set of how much money the state asks for as a result of weather-related disasters. And I've corrected all the values to $2020 here. And so you can see that there's a distinct break between 2004 and 2005, right? Before 2004, we rarely asked for much money. The biggest event we asked for was the big ice storm, which isn't showing up here in 1998. That's interesting. But it was about $15 million, an equivalent $2020. But you can see we're regularly asking for $20, $25, and $30 million for these. And most of those in the blue, I've highlighted the flood events. The white boxes represent the other events. What I really want to emphasize is this doesn't represent the entire cost of those floods. It's just what FEMA is reimbursing the state for. And I also want to emphasize that there's so much that's not captured in this, that climate change is wreaking havoc with our society. So you think about all the effects on human health that aren't captured in these presidentially declared disasters. You think about the impact that the dramatic spread of Lyme tick disease, which is not solely due to climate change, but climate change is sort of plays a role in how we change the animal dynamics and the distribution of Lyme ticks. And sort of many other instances in terms of how we're not capturing the true economic impacts of climate change. But this does show you that there's been a really big difference, and that difference really happened in terms of flooding in 2005. Next slide, Erich. So that's a little bit on how climate's changed and some of the social impacts in the past. I want to talk a little bit about the future, and this harkens back to a slide that Erich showed. One of the really challenges that scientists have is we can't tell you what climate is going to be like in the future because we don't know exactly how the human economic system is going to evolve. So right now, Erich covered, right? Climate changes, it always has and always will, but humans are now the main driver of climate, which means the choices we make today and over the next decade about how we use and how we produce energy is going to determine our climate in the past. Unfortunately, exactly how humans are going to behave is difficult to project. So instead of coming up and predicting it, what scientists do is develop a set of different scenarios. And that's the choice that we have that Erich mentioned. So here on the left-hand side, you've got a line graphs that show you projected annual global carbon emissions. The red line represents a high emissions scenario that's depicted by RCP 8.5. That's what scientists call it. And then there's a medium low emissions, let's call that low emissions for now, of RCP 4.5. And we use these as drivers to put into climate models, which are really powerful tools we use to project how much temperatures are going to change in the future. And so when you look on the right, you can compare the emissions scenario to actually what the projected global temperatures are, right? So the high emission scenario, RCP 8.5, you're looking at global temperatures increasing, maybe around 9 degrees Fahrenheit, but could be as high as 12, could be lower than that, maybe 8. And under the RCP 4.5, you see temperatures sort of leveling out at warming of 4.5 degrees. So we use these results and we downscale them to see how climate's going to change in New Hampshire. Next slide, Erich. And so here I'm providing some sort of ultra local data. It's Keene, it could be for Peterborough. Think about this as for Southwest New Hampshire. Again, you've got the two emission scenarios, the high emission scenario in red and the low emission scenario in blue. And what we're looking at is average summertime temperature in Keene. It's good for Peterborough too. So two really important things here. One is that by 2040, there's no difference between the high emissions and the low emissions scenario. What does that mean? We're pretty sure that's going to happen. That's the amount of warming that we're already committed to. So you can think about sort of another couple, maybe 3 degrees Fahrenheit of warming in southwestern New Hampshire. Second, if you look at the end of the century, there's a tremendous difference between the low emissions and the high emissions scenario. And I should emphasize that the dark red and blue line represents the ensemble mean, and that shaded area in the back represents the range of the models. but as climate scientists, we almost always use the ensemble mean as sort of the average of all the models as probably the best indicator of change. Can you go back a second, Erich? So you can see that there's a difference of really sort of, it's like about 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit between the low emissions and the high emissions scenario. But to get there, we need to turn the global energy system around really within the next decade if we're going to have any chance of staying on that blue line. Right now, even with the emissions reductions associated with the global pandemic, we're really on the high emissions scenario. Next slide, Erich. Okay, so what does, Erich said, so what about 5 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit? It doesn't mean much. You can equate that pretty directly to your body temperature. Just think about how you'd feel if you were 5 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than you are right now, right? You'd be dead. So that change is an indicator, it's a global average. And so we try to put this into indicators that make sense to people. And Erich showed you this, I'm going to show you again. This is the number of days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And now we're doing this in a statistically downscaled way. The RCP 4.5 is the low emissions, the RCP 8.5 is the high emissions. So what you see under the high emissions by the end of the century, if you look there at southern New Hampshire, you see sort of similar to numbers to what Erich said, 40 to 50, maybe 60 days per summer that are warmer than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Let me put that into context. That's 2/3 of a summer. That's a heat wave, punctuated by slightly less uncomfortable days. And right now, right, we have on average less than 10. It's why we love summers in New Hampshire. Even under the low emission scenarios, we're going to increase, but probably something we're going to be much better able to adapt to in sort of the 10 to 20 or 20 to 30 range in terms of days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide, Erich. In terms of precipitation, we don't see any big difference. Again, this is for Keene. It's the same results for New Hampshire and actually for most of the Northeast and the mid-latitudes in general. We see overall annual precipitation going up a bit because we have warmer sea surface temperatures and a warm atmosphere can hold more moisture. So I wouldn't even call this a silver lining, but we in New England are going to have fresh water. The challenge is that we don't see any increases in freshwater precipitation in summertime. So with the increased temperatures, we're likely to see more drought, similar to what we had this summer, right? Short-term drought that's going to affect really sort of water supplies and how much we can irrigate farmers' fields. But then fall, winter, and spring, we're likely to get more rain, and especially more of the precipitation we see coming in spring, which means that that can contribute to more flooding. And we do see an increase in the number of extreme precipitation events. So more rain, but more rain in fewer events and more flooding. Next slide. This is similar to the plot that Erich showed, but this is specific for sea level rise off the coast of New Hampshire. And these are key results from a report that we just wrote for the state legislature on flood risk summary for coastal New Hampshire. And you can see, if you look sort of in the middle of the graph, moving forward, there's that likely range. So there's a 67% probability that sea level rise by 2100 is going to be in that 3-foot range, right? But if you have a piece of infrastructure for which you have very low risk, so think about Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, think about a wastewater treatment plant, think about Seabrook Nuclear Power Station, think about State Route 16, the highway. Those all are vulnerable. And so we don't ever want those to flood. And so in terms of projections, you might think about looking at the 1% probability, which is the equivalent to a 1 in 100 year flood, or maybe even the 1 in 1,000 event. And so while it's not probable that we'll have sea level rise of 10 feet or 9 feet by 2100, it's not impossible. And again, that equates back really to how fast Greenland and Antarctica disintegrate. We've never seen them as scientists disintegrate. And so we don't really know, but we know something could happen, even though it's not probable. Thanks, Erich. Next slide. All right, so I think about a whole variety of strategies, and really these are based on mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation is adapting to the changes that are already in the pipeline. The single most important adaptation strategy is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions so we have less climate change to adapt to. So even though we separate these as scientists, they're fundamentally connected. Hit it, Erich? And I'm an optimist, and so I see climate change as the innovation opportunity of the 21st century, because it's really going to require us to transform our entire energy system, and indeed maybe even our social system and how we actually address these big challenges. But we've run out of time. We could have done much more if we'd acted 30 years ago, but we didn't. We've waited to the last minute, and so now we need to act really fast. And I would argue that there's no single silver bullet for solving this problem. We need to act at multiple spatial scales. So we need to act in cities and towns like Peterborough is doing now. We need to act at the state level. We need to act at the regional level and the country level. And in light of the lack of leadership from the federal government, we've been acting at the city and state level. And there's lots of great examples. And then we cannot rely solely on our government to solve this problem. They're a part of it. And a Biden-Harris presidency is going to be much better for addressing this. But we need business and investment and nonprofits and individuals and families to act as well. All right, a couple more slides here. As an individual, I now live pretty close to a net zero energy home. I've done this over 20 years. I got solar panels, I got heat pumps, I heat with wood pellets. My quality of life is better because I don't have a stinky basement with a bunch of fuel oil in it. But I've done this on a professor's salary, and it hasn't broken the bank because I've done it. When my boiler broke, I replaced it with a wood pellet boiler. I did the solar panels when my wife and I had saved up enough money. Unfortunately, society-wise, we're going to have to act a lot more rapidly than that. Next slide. I've helped my institution reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. We've been tracking emissions since 2001. And you can see that we are already 45% below 2010 emissions at UNH. And we've done this while we have saved money in our energy system. We now get most of our energy from a landfill gas, methane coming from a landfill that's about 10 miles away. And we've now committed to 75% below 2010 emissions by 2030. Next slide. And then this is a little bit different, but when I was down in Peterborough talking at the Lyceum a couple of years ago, I emphasized this. If there's something that everybody can do, especially those of us that are privileged enough to have savings, is invest in the future we want. And that's investing in environmental, social, and governance with SCREEN. And we got the University of New Hampshire to do this, and they moved 17% of our foundation into ESG investments 2 years ago. We're now up at 25%. Hit the slide, Erich. Our ESG investments have outperformed the main pool of our endowment over the last 5 years, 3 years, year, and year to date. And in fact, in 2020 alone, our ESG pool outperformed our main pool by over 5%. So not only are we investing the future we want, we're getting a better rate of return, and it's better for our students. Next slide. Hit it again. So this is my little comic, but I also want to say that so much of what we need to do is to engage the youth in this challenge. And I was just so taken yesterday by Amanda Gorman and her poem. I thought that she stole the show. And I just put up sort of 3 of the lines there that match my comic here, and I can't possibly do it justice, but I'll say it anyway. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. And part of what we're starting tonight is beginning to build those bridges, right? Within communities, between communities, and we're just gonna have to continue this really quickly and ramp up. All right, I think that's it. Back to you, Erich.
Yeah, and just building on some of the points that Cameron made, about building communities and building community sort of inertia towards these critical goals. I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're doing up here in the Upper Valley. So we have the Upper Valley Adaptation Work Group, which was actually modeled off of a group that Cam helped start down in the coastal region in New Hampshire. And one of the things we do is help to train residents here who are already interested in climate change, but help them to become community leaders to take actual action on climate change. So we have this Climate Change Leadership Academy, and we ran it successfully last year, and we're currently accepting applications for round 2. And like Cam, I've been trying to walk the walk as much as I can, not just in my volunteer work with UVA and the Leadership Academy, but doing things like these talks. I'm working with Dartmouth. Dartmouth is lagging behind UNH in our efforts to reduce CO2, so I'm trying to hold their feet to the fire a little bit. And we're working on that, that plan that Cam's on, right? We're weatherizing our home. We're gonna sign up for community solar. Unfortunately, our roof is not well sited for solar with all the trees around us. We buy fuel efficient cars when our cars break down. The next one we buy is fuel efficient. We got a Prius in 2010. The next one will be some sort of electric vehicle. We're trying to eat less red meat. We're reducing our personal travel. I found when I did my carbon footprint calculation, and this is something you should all do, I found out that my airplane travel was a significant part of it. And that's something that was pretty easy to reduce, especially in the Zoom world where I can avoid business meetings in person. And we're composting at home. And I think really importantly, we're teaching our children, not just my kids personally, but I feel like that's a big part of my mission here at Dartmouth is when I teach any of my classes, making sure that the next generation understands this challenge. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, we have this moral obligation as well. And this is true at any scale you look at, whether it's within an individual town or within a state or within the United States or internationally. On any scale you look at, the people who are most affected by climate change are the ones who are least responsible for creating the problem in the first place. So we do have those who are able to act, have this moral obligation to act. And so we're going to pass it over to Dori now and talk about a few of the benefits for the pocketbook that come along with this sort of action.
Great. Thank you both. Very inspiring. So I just want to talk about the added benefits of renewables, since that is what we're focusing on for this campaign, that it's not just good for the planet, it's also good for the pocketbook. Erich, can you, so lots of you are familiar with the Peterborough solar array for the wastewater treatment plant. And it's great for reducing our greenhouse gases, but it also is saving the town $18,000 a year. And that's in a utility climate that is, let's say, less than ideal. And we're still able to sell that, to save that. In Hanover, they have been doing some amazing retrofits on their municipal buildings. So in their town hall, they replaced their heaters with heat pumps that are run off of PV or solar panels on their roof, and they are saving $13,000 a year doing that. They are also installing some very large solar arrays on their public safety buildings, and they are saving $27,000 a year there. So it's very, it's really good for convincing folks who don't necessarily feel the same kind of moral need like Erich was talking about to act, that we can let them know that it's also really good for the town's budget. And overall, in New England, they just came out with a study that showed how rooftop solar on, large buildings and small buildings between the years 2015 and 2020 saved the entire region over $1 billion. And that's not just for the folks who have rooftop solar, it's for everybody, all ratepayers. And that's because with the added solar, you don't have to fire up coal plants on those hottest days of the year, and which are very expensive to run, so that they don't have to fire those up. So it saves ratepayers whether or not you've got solar. So just wanting to add that there are other reasons that we can discuss with our friends and neighbors who might be more persuaded by economic arguments. With this slide and with Erich and Cameron finishing up their presentations, we would love to hear questions, and the best way to do that would be to put them in the chat, and we will try to take them as we see them. So please feel free to ask either of them any questions, or if you've got questions about the campaign, I can try to answer those. So please let us know. I think I would like to start off with a question, and I know that Cameron, you talked about needing to have change or to act on many different levels. I guess what I want to know is, do you, if you're only going to be able to act on one level or another, would you ask folks to try to do it on an individual level or more of a collective level?
So ultimately the answer is we have to act on a collective level. We have to drive systematic change in our entire energy system in order to solve this problem. And frankly, we've just done the experiment of, well, what happens if we all stay at home and don't travel? We see a modest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of fossil fuel, but for the most part, they've been offset by increasing forest fires that Erich highlighted in California and in Australia. So it's really the much broader systematic action. But that doesn't mean we don't need to act, nor does it mean we can wait and let the federal government fix this, because they probably won't. Individual action is important, one, because it proves to you that it's possible and you can do it cost effectively. And then I think it really gives you the moral authority to demand your institutions, whether that's your municipality or your university or your business or your church or the place where you recreate, to go ahead and do that. So the individual action really informs you and gives you some moral authority on moving forward, but you need to take that to drive the systematic change. And I think while governments can help, I really think it's through the institutional lens of our businesses, our investments, where we pray, where we recreate, that if all of those entities begin to reduce our emissions, that's going to provide sort of the example and the good New England know-how on how to solve this problem.
And Cam's exactly right. And one other thing I'll add about individual action is that it can be a real motivator for your neighbors and your friends and your family, right? When they see someone who they know and they trust doing these sorts of things, they go, well, wait a minute, okay, they can do it. I can do it. I guess I should do it. Why aren't I doing it? Right? That's really, really important. It can be a real motivator.
Thank you. Great answers. I guess I'd also like to know, what would be some first steps to that any individual could make to making a difference in this effort?
I'm happy to start. I think the most important first step is to start asking the question, whatever I'm going to do in terms of spending money or change or things I'm going to do in my life, that you begin to not solely focus on the issue of climate change, but you integrate that into your decision making. So Erich put this very nicely. It's like, oh, when we buy a car, well, every time we buy a car, we take that as an opportunity to do something that's going to serve the purposes of our family, get us around, but reduce the emissions into the atmosphere. And you can do it. That's easy to do on an individual level. It's more challenging to do on an institutional level, but it means you need to be, or people need to be at the table that are demanding answers to those questions, and that those issues are considered. And so one of the ways to do that, right, is to pass an ordinance that says, we're going to have a target, and now that forces everybody in the town to do that. So I think you're doing a really good job sort of providing that framework. I guess just one other thing, and Erich mentioned it, is I think education is so important, but it's not just education about the science. I think it's really important for us to, how do I say this, open our hearts and open our minds and really get people on different political spectrums to be engaged in this effort. There's always going to be a group of people on both sides who for whom reason is not important. But there's a solid core, and I have I'm an immigrant to this country, but I've been here for 33 years, and I have solid respect for good old New Hampshire conservatism. And I think that's, we need to get more conservatives to really understand that this is actually about conservation. It's about preserving or trying to preserve what's left of our quality of life here in New Hampshire and New England. Take, as Uncle Joe said yesterday, right? Let's dial down the temperature of our discussions and let's have those discussions. And what I found is that when you do that, you find out that people really value the places that they live in New Hampshire. And that if you can start out with that shared value, we can make more progress.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I completely agree. We've got some questions that have come into the chat. The first one is, could you talk about how Sununu has impacted New Hampshire's actions on the climate?
Over to you, Erich. You can start on this one.
No, man, this is all you.
I'd like to say he has accomplished more. In terms of the family he comes from, I would argue he's probably the most reasonable when it comes to the issue of climate change. But the Sununu family have long taken the path of actually being climate deniers and about being very resistant to taking the action that we need to change. And so the governor has not done well on this front. And I think there needs to be additional pressure from the citizens of New Hampshire in encouraging him to understand that if you want to see actually lower energy prices for people, what you need to do is invest in the energy of the future, not the energy of the past. Are there challenges? Absolutely. But the future is renewables. And if New Hampshire doesn't get its act together pretty quickly, it's going to be left behind in a market as Maine, Massachusetts, and Vermont storm ahead into renewables. And so I think that there's some economic liability with lagging behind on the renewable energy. And there's hope, Dori, as you mentioned, there's lots of communities that are stepping up to the plate and saying, we're going to make this happen anyway. So hopefully that pressure will help the legislature change direction and the governor.
Anything you want to add, Erich?
No, I think Cam captured it nicely.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember how many of his vetoes were energy bills, but there were, I don't remember the exact number, but there were a bunch of them. I knew Pat would know the answer. 56 of them were energy bills of the vetoed bills that he did this last session. Some really good news from Keene. The city council passed the sustainable energy plan that came out of their 100% renewable resolution. They just passed it 20 minutes ago. So that's awesome. Go Keene. And I see here too that Allie Samuels is kind of posing, throwing down the gauntlet for Peterborough to catch up to Keene. And we are definitely up for that challenge. Other questions? Let's see.
Yeah, I had one sent to me over a private message. And so it was along the lines of talking about, I think, individual revisions to your home. The specific gentleman is wondering, should I cut down trees to be able to have the right sun peak in for solar? And I think it brings up a good question of, for people who have the ability to make these updates to their home, where should they start to know which the improvements would be best for their energy consumption as a household? What resources are there out there to be able to not only get the right information, but also take advantage of maybe the limited incentives there are within our state to make those projects happen?
Well, I could talk a little bit about how we're approaching this. So we're going through the New Hampshire Saves program, where there are some financial incentives to get an energy audit to your house, and then improve things like insulation and windows, overall efficiency of the home, tighten it up. So that's a process that we've been under sort of slowly again. I mean, obviously these are big ticket items. To go insulate your whole basement and to replace a bunch of windows can be a lot of money. So we've got sort of a plan that we're pacing this out over the next several years. And then in terms of solar, you know, I hear that comment specifically. As I mentioned, we live in the woods, and you know, we had 2 different companies come out and cite our house for solar, and they both recommended against it. And so, you know, the development of this idea of community solar, where you buy in with a group of other neighbors, you buy into a solar array that's somewhere close by. It's usually within your town or somewhere, you know, maybe the next town over. And so you are creating new solar infrastructure. You're putting up new panels, but it's just not on your property. And what's one of the advantages of that is that people like renters can participate as well, because you can take that with you when you move from place to place. So that's what we're planning to buy into in this next year. Again, saving up a little bit of money so that we can make that investment.
So I just agree with Erich. I think tightening up your home is, especially for a lot of those beautiful old homes we have in New Hampshire. We don't want to tear them down and build new energy efficient homes. We love them. So how is it can we can improve the energy efficiency there, and then think about renewables. But it does come back to sort of there's not one answer. There's many different answers, and so it's not like a solar or my trees. That's just a false dichotomy. Back away from that and figure out what your other options are on that front. And if you don't want to cut those trees, don't cut them down, because those trees are sucking up lots of carbon dioxide, and there's lots of carbon in the roots of those trees. If you want to cut them down because you don't like them and put solar panels on, you can do that too. But there's more than one way to solve that problem. And community solar, I think, is going to be a really big answer as we move forward.
I'd also like to offer another answer that New Hampshire has now. As Nora says, there's 38% of Peterborough residents are renters, so they wouldn't be able to be getting solar panels anyway. And there is a relatively new law called Community Power that allows for municipalities to purchase electricity on behalf of all of their residents and all of their businesses who currently get the default rate from the utility. And that allows them to both negotiate a lower price and to increase the percentage of renewables. And you can increase that over time until it becomes 100%. And I believe that that is a major part of the plan in Keene that just got passed. And so that's another really good option. And it's actually the most equitable way to do it, because it doesn't require that you buy anything. It just means that you're paying your electric bill. So I'm just wanting to put that out there. It is a minute before 8. And while I see some other really good questions, I would love to just share a few ways that people can help support our campaign in Peterborough. And Cameron and Erich, if we've got questions that didn't get answered, would you be willing to answer them in a follow-up email?
Happy
Absolutely.
to.
Wonderful. Thank you. And if they're about the campaign, I would also be very willing to answer them later. So if you live in Peterborough, there are actually a couple of different petitions that you can sign. The first is the warrant article petition that we need to have 25 folks sign in order to actually get the petition on the ballot. And if you would be willing to do that, you can go to our website and download it. Or actually, do we have it in the chat? We can also put it in the chat. And if you download it and print it out, and then you can mail it to the address on the instruction sheet, then we can collect them and give them to the town, and we can make sure that we get it on the ballot. In addition to that, we've got another petition just in general support of this commitment. And that is also on our website. And can we put that link in the chat as well? And you can sign that whether or not you live in Peterborough. Excuse me. The other thing that we would ask for, if you do live in Peterborough, or if you have friends that live in Peterborough, we really want people's input to what we're proposing. We want to know what your hopes are around it, what your concerns are around it, and we want to have a discussion so that we can answer questions and really take your ideas into consideration as we move forward. And so we are going to be doing several community dialogues that will facilitate this kind of conversation. We're going to be doing our first kind of grouping of them beginning next week at the exact same time that we're meeting today, next Thursday at 7. And there are a couple of other dates the following week. You can sign up for those at our website, peterboroughenergyaction.org. And if you don't live in Peterborough, if you know folks who live in Peterborough, and especially folks who might not be really keyed into this issue, we want to hear from those folks too. So please sign up and let your friends know about it and ask them to sign up as well. And it is 8:02. So I want to respect everybody's time. Thank you so much, Erich and Cameron. Your expertise and your ability to both do the science and the community work is really inspiring. And we really appreciate your time tonight. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us, Dori, and really wish you all the best in your efforts down in Peterborough and Keene, and in fact, the whole southwest region of New Hampshire. You guys are probably the area that can really lead us to where we need to be. So keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on this effort, guys. Really, really nice job.
Thank you. And if you're from another town that is inspired by what you heard tonight and might be interested in starting a campaign in your own town in the Monadnock region, please contact Annie Henry at the Monadnock Sustainability Hub, and we would be happy to help you get started with a campaign of your own. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you at the ballot box in May.